Hey guys, what's up? I'll be continuing this week with freshly released digital audio players, and the very first in line is this one. So this is the FiiO M11S, which seems like the smallest, the most portable and affordable digital audio player. With a little bit of sadness, it seems that a successor to the M5, M6 and M9 won't be coming anytime soon, making M11S pretty much the most affordable unit that goes for $500, and it's time to check it out. Design-wise, it looks very much the same with its twin brother M11S, M11 Plus. So as you can see, M11S is shorter, it's smaller, it's lighter weight, but the build quality is pretty much the same. So of course we're talking about machined aluminum cases. It has pretty much the same layout, the same buttons, inputs and outputs, so the same legendary build quality is on board. There is a glass panel on its back that will improve signal strength of wireless connections as Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. In the end, we're getting the premium build quality of their higher priced DAPs, and in my opinion, that makes it very appealing. FiiO went with a slightly smaller 5-inch 720p screen, but since its body is shorter to M11 Plus, we are getting a smaller chin below that screen, looking almost bezel-less in comparison. The pixel density is identical to that of M11 Plus, and I believe it uses a similar IPS panel, which has a decent contrast ratio and viewing angles. It's bright enough, of course, in sunny days, and since it's smaller, it won't impact battery levels as much as their M11 Plus and M17 are doing. FiiO still has some work to do when it comes to ergonomics, because 3 sides from 4 sides are populated with buttons, ports, inputs and outputs, and that could be a small issue, but in a few days you learn them all. You can find everything on its bottom, so all inputs and outputs. It has 3 headphone jacks, so basically covering all your balanced and single-ended needs. There's a single-ended micro SD card and a USB Type-C used for charging, data transfer and USB DAC mode. As for tech inside it, it rocks a Snapdragon 660, which is not the latest and the greatest silicon of Qualcomm, but you know, it works in their flagship devices like M11 Plus and M17, and it's good enough for a portable DAP. There are 3 gigs of RAM memory and 32 gigs of ROM memory, which is not so much, barely enough for a few DSD albums. I do recommend getting a higher capacity micro SD card. A 1 terabyte would be just amazing, because that one is not so expensive nowadays. There's an Android 10.0 on board. It's unlocked, of course, so you can install any third-party app from Google Play Store. It uses 2 ES9038 Q2M DAC chips, 2 units for a fully balanced signal, and of course several OPA op-amps, again working in a fully balanced configuration, and it offers some crazy numbers like 670 milliwatts of power in 32 ohms. That's a lot of power considering its size and price point. That's even more power than what you can find on M11 Plus, which is more expensive, mind you. So it might cannibalize a few sales of the M11 Plus. Since its inner workings were better optimized for portable use, so it doesn't have desktop-grade components, desktop-grade DAC chips, it has actually a longer battery life compared to any other portable DAP of FiiO. So it has almost 14 hours, a lot more compared to M11 Plus and a lot more compared to M17. So if battery life is important to you and a lot of power is also important to you, then M11S is quite an amazing digital audio player of FiiO. It offers dual-band Wi-Fi and all those fancy Bluetooth codecs as a sender but also as a receiver. There's an MKW renderer as well, so amazing specs all around, but let's check how it actually performs. It might sound like some gibberish nonsense to FiiO engineers and to a few viewers around here, for that I'm sure, but I'm actually glad that FiiO didn't went with THX AAA amplifier modules in this one, but with a traditional op-amp based output stage and amplifier stage. because, you know, living with THX triple amplifiers by now for a long time, I know exactly how they sound, and while you cannot beat them when it comes to measurements, resolution, detail retrieval, they might sound a little thin, lacking body, lacking weight, especially in the mid-range. And this is where M11S actually sounds quite different compared to M11 Plus and M17. It's a different sounding unit in terms of tonality. So it's smoother, it's more organic, it has a better flow compared to M11 Plus and M17. It's a little more natural sounding, so just in a single word, it's more natural sounding. At the cost of a lower resolution and a transient response, because it's not as hyper detailed like M17 or M11 Plus ESS version, and it's not as fast and impactful sounding as those two. But still, you know, this is cheaper, this is smaller, it has a bigger battery life, and it sounds more organic and more natural, so there is a lot to like in this one. It's still being powered by ESS Sabre silicon, so of course resolution is quite high with this one, even if there is a little bit less information compared to M11 Plus ESS and M17, it's still quite a clean and detailed sounding unit. However, the biggest surprise for me was power output, and I believe it will slowly, maybe a little bit, cannibalize the sales of M11 Plus, which is costlier but not as powerful. It was able to drive pretty much my entire headphone collection with the exception of 3 desktop headphones, so be the Meze Elite, Kenerton, Rognir, what else, RZH Phobos, Apos Caspian, HD800S. It was driving them all, no problem, on high gain, and there was enough headroom remaining on top. So of course that was quite a surprise, because it's not that expensive and it's not that heavy and big. So yeah, amazing power output. Its noise floor is very similar to that of M11 Plus, which is costlier, and it's much lower compared to M17, which is way costlier. And of course, all the latest FiiO DAPs have an invisible noise floor with ultra-sensitive IEMs, and this is where M11S is pretty much no different. So you can go max power, you can go high gain with ultra-sensitive IEMs, with music compose, of course, and you won't hear really anything, like the unit is being powered off completely. So of course you can use anything, ultra-sensitive IEMs, portable over-ear headphones, desktop headphones, you'll never hear traces of noise with this one, which is, you know, not a big surprise for me, and it shouldn't be a surprise for you. This is a noiseless sounding unit. When it comes to output power, 670 milliwatts of power per channel in 32 ohms via its balanced output is actually a lot of power, considering its price and its pocket-friendly size. Its competition, so let's check its competition. Hibi RS5 Mark II offers considerably less power. Hibi RS2, which costs more or less the same, offers about 3 times less power. FiiO M11 Plus is costlier but offers less power. ShineLink M6 version 21 less power, ShineLink M6 version 21 Pro less power, so at this size and price point, this is pretty much the most powerful digital audio player that you can get. And of course, it wasn't a big surprise for me that it was able to drive a big collection of headphones, desktop headphones, not only IEMs or portable over-ears, with the exception of 3 headphones, and those were Odyssey LCD4, Odyssey LCD5, and HiFiMan Susvara. Everything else worked just outstanding. So for example, with Meze Elite, I was at around 85 out of 120, so leaving a huge headroom on top. The same story repeated itself with RZH Phobos. Only with Kenerton Rognir, I was at around 88 for the same SPL. And everything else, like Apos Caspian, Kenerton Valley, I needed to lower that volume much lower. So there was always a substantial headroom remaining on top. So that was actually quite a surprise, getting so much power from such a portable device. So in this regard, it's very impressive. Moving on to soundstage, scale and depth and so on, I will just remind you that it still uses 2 DAC chips, and of course there is a fully balanced amplifier stage. It offers about 3 times more power via its balanced output and a much lower channel crosstalk via its balanced outputs. So if you want the widest possible sound, if you want the deepest sound, the biggest sound, please use its balanced connection, because for us headphone listeners, channel crosstalk is the biggest enemy you can have with amplifier designs, because channel crosstalk is actually killing Soundstage. So use its balanced connection if you want the biggest sound that you can get. When it comes to stage size in general, it sounds more or less the same with their M11 Plus, which for me was already quite airy, but in my opinion, these two are offering a medium-sized soundstage, so not as big sounding as, for example, M17, not as big as FiiO RS6, but still, quite impressive in terms of layering and scale. With tracks like Industrial Disease by Dire Straits, you can feel that this tune was recorded in a bigger room compared to, say, a Led Zeppelin track or album. So there is more space. You can feel that there is a bigger space in between the drummer, the bass player, the guitar player, the vocalists. Everything is not fighting for prime time, and everything is located in its own bubble of sounds. So in terms of soundstage, maybe it's not as big sounding as M17 or FiiO RS6, but still I believe it will show you how big that track is sounding with your headphones. So even with IEMs, not only with open back headphones. When it comes to transient response, or how fast and how impactful it can sound, it felt a little lackluster compared to M11 Plus and M17. And that shouldn't come as a surprise, because it uses a mobile version of that ESS Sabre Silicon, and you can feel that the bass is not as fast, is not as nimble, is not as punchy sounding. This one was punchy mostly with rock and electronica tunes, but with something like jazz and acoustic stuff, only M17 and to a lesser degree M11 Plus were punchy and impactful. So just imagine punchy sounding blues tunes, and that happens with M17. So this one still is quite good in this department, just not amazing. So it's not as fast, and that was the first thing that it was very apparent. Something is slowing it down just a little bit. With tunes like 3 Kilos by The Prodigy, I was immediately toy tapping and headbanging, so the bass was definitely there, but the pace was not that impressive. And I believe that it works just okay with super fast tunes, but it works much better with something like drum and bass that has a slower pace. So it's not bad, just not amazing in terms of transient response. Detail retrieval is another area that felt less impressive versus M11 Plus. And that's okay, because FiiO still needs to sell that M11 Plus, so that's okay. And while that resolution went by a notch or two down, I still find it clearer, for example, compared to FiiO R5 Mark II or FiiO RS2, which will be following that review. So this is still quite clean sounding, just not ultra clean, ultra revealing sounding as M17, for example. So all those small nuances are still hovering outside my head. I can still focus on the smallest things, but those are not stealing my attention. So those are not super contoured. The leading edges are not as strong and sharp as it happens with M17, for example. Long story short, this is still a decently clean sounding unit that will impress you a lot more with the simplest things, with the act of music listening, and a lot less than the technical level of the M17, which is more linear and colorless sounding by comparison. Moving on to frequency response, I feel that FiiO went with a slightly different tuning with this one. Not slight, actually quite a big difference, because it doesn't sound linear, but more like V-shaped compared to the rest of their doings. So there is more bass quantity-wise, it's thicker, but it's slower sounding in the bass. So quantity-wise you are getting more, but quality-wise you are getting less. And I know it sounds a little weird that I just described that it doesn't pound the bass, and that is actually true, because you're not hearing a kick and then a long rumble, but you're hearing just a rumble without the kick. So it's a little slow, and that kills that timing, that the transient response. So if you like a mellow type of bass that is slightly higher in terms of quantity, then you'll be liking the sound of M11S. Mid-range is probably the only area that didn't go up or down from linearity, and with all due respect to FiiO engineers, I do believe that THX AAA circuitry is messing a little bit with mid-range purity. So while I find it exactly as linear, straight as a line as M17 or M11 Plus, I do believe that the mid-range is a little nicer. So there's a bigger cojones with males, and of course the females are sounding a little sweeter. So I can say that it's warm or organic sounding, but it's definitely a little more real sounding compared to M17 and M11 Plus. Treble output goes a little higher than usual, but that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, because FiiO loves a slightly hotter treble output as opposed to Shanling or Hebe that likes a calmer and a smoother top octave. So if you are a treble head, then M11S will impress you right away, and if you have treble intensive IEMs or desktop headphones, then it would be wiser going with a different DAP. While quite strong in terms of intensity, I still don't find it edgy or bright sounding, so that's okay. Wrapping things up, M11S moves exactly as fast as their flagship devices. There is slightly more power on tap compared to competitive devices. There's a longer battery life, all the inputs and outputs that you can think of. They went with a slightly different tuning this time around, and for me that's a big plus, because their flagship devices are sounding more or less the same in terms of tonality. They finally started experimenting with op-amps once again, and that's a win-win situation, because we're getting cheaper devices and a higher price to performance ratio. It was noiseless and distortionless with IEMs and desktop headphones, and apart from a less impressive resolution and transient response, I will be recommending this one up as an amazing sounding digital audio player. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed my review. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and as usual, listen to my tunes, be positive, and I'll see you around. Cheers!